I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Did you know that the religiously unaffiliated make up nearly 30% of U.S. adults and are the largest sector by religious identification? Our guest today, Ryan T. Cragun, will tell us what the data says about the health and happiness of the non-religious.
The Freedom From Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
The happiest person, the element, the everything that's going to be happy. People of religion are going to be happy again. And I really believe you can't be happy without religion, without that belief. I really believe it. I just don't see how you can be. So let's bring religion back. Let's bring God back into our lives.
That is Trump at the National Prayer Breakfast this year. Really? You can't be happy without religion? Our guest today will tell us what the data say about that and many other claims about religious people. Ryan T. Cragun is a professor of sociology at the University of Tampa. He focuses mainly on Mormonism and non-religion. He's the author or co-author of many books, including Beyond Doubt, The Secularization of Society, What You Don't Know About Religion, But Should, Christianity and the Limits of Minority Acceptance, which is subtitled God Loves Almost Everyone, and the intriguingly titled book, How to Defeat Religion in 10 Easy Steps.
Ryan Cragun's newest book, co-authored with Jesse M. Smith, is called Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization. And we're going to talk with him about that book, as well as the latest Pew survey showing the growth of the religiously unaffiliated. Welcome back to Freethought Matters, Professor Cragun.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a delight to be on the show.
Nice to have you back. So, supporting what we just heard Donald Trump say, a Pew study reported that active religious people tend to be happier. But in your book, you write, religiosity doesn't make people healthier or happier. So who's right, you or Pew?
I love the question, and not surprisingly, I'm going to say I'm right. We can dig just quickly into their little caveat phrase right at the beginning, active religious people. That's a core kind of assumption that they're building into this. So if you were to include all religious people, not surprisingly, you're going to find that there's no difference between the religious and non-religious. I've written extensively about this. I wrote an entire book chapter comparing the religious and non-religious using a variety of different measures in 50 plus different countries around the world, looking at the relationship between religiosity and happiness. Not surprisingly, we find that there is no meaningful relationship between religiosity and happiness, using a ton of different measures, making very robust comparisons. There's just nothing there. Not surprisingly, Trump is ignoring data. Shocker.
I guess it's tribalism, but I was kind of hoping you'd find out that freethinkers were happier.
That would be great, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of a radical empiricist. I follow the data, and the data say that there are just no meaningful differences there. There's just nothing there.
That says a lot in itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we find similar stuff with health and a lot of other things. So I'm happy to talk about those others. But yeah, Donald Trump is absolutely wrong on this.
So before we talk more about these claims about the religious people always having a better life than the non-religious, can you tell us who the non-religious are?
Sure. So it depends on the measure that you use, but most commonly, the measure that we use to kind of distinguish the non-religious from the religious is typically kind of a multiple choice question that people get in a survey where they say, what is your religion, if any? And according to Pew, there are different groups that do it differently, but Pew uses 3 groups to distinguish who the non-religious are. Those who say nothing in particular, which I don't love, and I've told them that, atheists and agnostics, and you will both know this, that atheism and agnosticism are not religions. But for some reason, they include all of those in there, and that's the group that they consider to be the non-religious. Other surveys just say those who say they have no religious affiliation. So that's generally what we mean by it.
And it's a very robust group at this point.
In the U.S., we're hovering around 30-ish% of the population. In other countries, it's much higher. Other countries, it's lower. But yeah, so we're right around 30%, and it's grown dramatically over the last 30 years or so.
So according to the data, are non-religious people less likely to vote or volunteer or be civically engaged?
So again, it depends on how you parse the data. Some people try and parse it in really interesting ways. So if you pull out atheists, those who identify their religion as an atheist, which is not a religion, but those who identify as atheists, they're actually more likely to vote than most other groups, including most religious groups. If you include them in with everybody else who's not religious, then the differences largely wash out. But if you pull atheists out and then look at just the nothings in particular, the nones, excluding atheists, then the nothing in particular are actually a little less likely to vote. That's actually true. But if you include them all together, there are no differences.
And that's true for our membership. I mean, 99% of our members are registered voters who have voted in the last presidential election.
Yeah, but our surveys are somewhat self-selected, but still it tells you something. Mm-hmm. So there have been a rash of books in the last decade or so claiming religion is good for your health and happiness. But you say in your book that researchers like Robert Putnam and David Campbell have used flawed data when they analyze religion. You say they cooked the books and they massaged the data. How so? And have you pointed this out to them, or have they even responded?
Yeah, they wouldn't respond to me. I did actually try and publish a paper on this, and it wasn't well received, me criticizing a Harvard professor and a Notre Dame professor. And literally that's what they said is like, really, why do you have to criticize them? It's kind of annoying. But let me explain how they cook the books. Basically, when they were cutting up their different groups that they were trying to compare, they took all of the people who were religious and then they parceled out a subset of the religious. And these are the people who are actively engaged with religion. They go to religious services regularly. They're kind of doing all of the things that would make them really active. And they said, those are the people that we're going to consider religious. Then they took all the people who say, no, I have a religious affiliation. I believe in God. I do all of these things, but I don't go. And they lumped them in with the non-religious. And then they made their comparisons between those two groups. So they're like, oh, these are the non-religious, which actually include people who say they're religious, but they don't go. And they compared them to the actively religious. And that's where they come out and they're like, see, these actively religious people who are civically engaged and doing all of these things, they're more likely to donate money, they're healthier, they're happier, et cetera. But they basically kind of set it up in advance that they were going to find exactly what they wanted, because people who don't go are less engaged. They're just less civically engaged in general. So not surprisingly, the less civically engaged are less civically engaged. And then they made this big kind of hoo-ha about how religious people are better in all of these other ways, but they cooked the books in the way that they subset their sample. And no one really pointed that out, which I was kind of shocked by, because it's all kind of in an appendix at the back of the book where you have to detail, like, here's how they divided their sample. But it turns out, their book, American Grace, which is like a New York Times bestseller, it was based on a flawed assumption and a flawed way of analyzing the data.
Isn't it true that some religious groups might actually have dietary or avoiding drinking? I mean, there might be some health benefits to belonging to one particular group.
I love that question. I get that question a lot, and I'm happy to kind of illustrate why I think this is a little bit problematic. So I will absolutely concede that religions can have indirect health benefits for people, and it's exactly through the ways that you just described, Dan. That basically, if a religion says, hey, don't drink alcohol, then you get the benefits of not drinking alcohol. But the actual health benefit doesn't derive from the religion, it derives from not drinking alcohol. So it's kind of a mediation effect that basically religions are saying, don't do these things. And then if you don't do them, then you get the health benefits. But if you're not religious and you don't drink alcohol or you don't smoke cigarettes, you're going to get all of the same benefits. It's not that religion is causing that, it's that religion is leading it indirectly to those paths. So you could say indirectly religion may benefit some people, but it's not being religious. There's no way that you can argue that like believing in God or saying I'm Catholic somehow makes people healthier. That's not what does it. It's the healthy behaviors that make people healthier.
And of course, Catholics probably end up drinking more wine because they're introduced to it in church.
Yeah. So, and I actually don't have numbers on that. I wish I had numbers on who drinks more. I haven't seen really good survey data on that.
So we do have more questions. Are religious people nicer to other people?
Going back to the 1950s, Gordon Allport, and I'll come back to my book on this, but Gordon Allport actually found that that's not true. In fact, he found just the opposite, and then he developed this whole kind of weird, strange theoretical explanation to try and explain why that's not the case. But he actually found the opposite. He found that non-religious people were more accepting of racial and ethnic and gender minorities. They were more accepting of immigrants. They were just generally more tolerant. That still generally holds today. But in my book with Jesse Smith, we try not to make a big deal out of it because the differences aren't so big that it looks like the non-religious are super, super nice. It's basically kind of a wash, that there's not a huge difference, but you're definitely not going to see that. And then if you get into some of the details, atheists in particular, but non-religious people are more accepting of immigrants. They're more accepting of gender minorities. Race is kind of a wash at this point, but there are a couple of areas where the non-religious are more accepting of a variety of minority groups or migrants. But for the most part, there aren't big differences here at all.
In your book, you point out, who would you like to be your neighbor? And there was no difference in there, right?
Yeah, no one really wants alcoholics to be their neighbor or drug addicts. But not surprising, right? But I was actually kind of surprised. I have to admit, I was a little surprised. There's no difference between religious and non-religious people on like having same-sex couples as your neighbor, having immigrants as your neighbor, having non-religious people as your neighbor, like people of a different religion. No differences. So on a lot of them, there was just no meaningful difference.
Or unmarried couples as your neighbor, right?
Yep, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So are non-religious people less moral?
It's another really great question. I love that you're just setting these up for me. No, but complicated. Religious people and non-religious people have different moralities, and that's where it gets really tricky. So certainly if you're using something like premarital sex as your core value for morality, then yeah, you're going to see that they have very different views on whether people should have premarital or extramarital sex. But it's just because non-religious people don't even see that as a moral question. So you can't really judge non-religious people as being more or less moral if it's not a moral question for them. And you could always flip that around and say, well, non-religious people actually would see religious people as less moral for their views on LGBTQ individuals. So if you're using kind of their own respective moralities, then yeah, you're going to see differences, and you may be able to argue like, oh, they're more moral or they're less moral. But if you use more kind of universal criteria for morality, things like cheating on your taxes, jumping the turnstile to get on the subway, not paying, your different taxes, things like that. If you use just generally kind of objective criteria, we see no differences whatsoever.
A lot of religious groups, conservative groups, call themselves values voters. What about family values?
Oh, geez. We call this, I'm pretty sure in the book, we call this Orwellian doublespeak, which hopefully your listeners are familiar with that phrase. We find it really problematic because basically what they're saying is, oh no, we really value family. This is conservative religious individuals. We really value family as long as they have our same values. If they don't, we'll kick them out. We will cut off our family. So if you're thinking about it from that perspective, it's actually quite Orwellian and disturbing. But then we also look at survey data asking people, how much do you value your family? How much do you value your friends? How much do you value kids? How likely are you to beat your kids? How likely are you to beat your wife? And on all of those measures, there are no differences. Just no differences whatsoever. Yeah, it's just not there.
So do non-religious people have fewer children?
Now, that is one that is true. Non-religious people do have slightly fewer kids on average. That is actually true. And that's true not just in the US, but around the world. So we can actually see that. So when we're looking at differences between religious and non-religious individuals, there is one difference that we find in the book that's a meaningful difference, and that's that non-religious people do have fewer kids on average.
So I wonder if that's because the women are more apt to be feminists, or that atheists are more apt to be educated, and educated people have fewer children?
I'm sure that contributes to it. We do find some minor educational differences. Certainly atheists really stand out when it comes to educational differences, but the non-religious as a whole, there aren't really big differences there. But there are also just kind of some differences in terms of their values. So there are some religions still that are very pro-natal. I mean, if you're a strict Catholic, right, birth control is out. You're not allowed to use any form of birth control. And then there are other religious groups, the Amish and Hutterites, that are actually very pro-natal. Mormons are supposedly more pro-natal, but their difference in terms of the number of kids isn't that big anymore. So there are some religions that are pro-natal, and you just don't get that with the non-religious. The non-religious are more educated generally, but they don't have any kind of motivation that's pushing them to be more pro-natalist.
Are religious people healthier than non-religious?
Yeah, no. There's really no evidence to support that. I mean, we talked about the indirect effects, but what we did in the book, and we actually did this just to be very robust about this, we used a variety of different measures to try and capture this. So there's one that's just like a self-report measure. How healthy do you consider yourself? And it's usually on like a 3 or 4 point scale. You see no differences on the basis of religion, but we were like, okay, maybe that's not satisfactory for everybody. So we threw in a couple of additional measures. One of them is, of the last 30 days, how many days were you so unhealthy that you couldn't do the things that you normally need to do? And that actually also captures things like chronic disease and other more complicated issues. It's a slightly more objective measure. Shocker, no difference, just no differences whatsoever.
So
there is just no evidence to
I am
support.
hearing a theme here. So you conclude your book, Ryan, Goodbye to Religion, by writing, the simplest takeaway is that everyone who is worried about declining religiosity in the U.S. should relax. And when we come back, we want to ask you about the newest religious landscape survey by Pew Research Center and what it says about the non-religious.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
My name's Jarvis, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I'm sure many of you have seen Clash of the Titans or The Immortals or 300, these blockbuster films about ancient Greek or Roman religion, which we now call mythology. But back then it wasn't mythology. It was very real for them. They genuinely believed that you had to put a coin in a person's mouth before they were buried so that they could pay for the literal ferry to the afterlife. Just as many people today believe that they should eat crackers and wine on a Sunday, or that God wants women to hide their bodies under black burqas. Every religion that has ever existed, and there are many, have all believed that they were right, that their rituals and rules and beliefs were 100% correct, and they all thought they nailed it. But where are they today? If they're not completely forgotten, they're on the silver screen, amusing us with their sword fights, animal sacrifices, and oracles. The religions of today are the entertainment of tomorrow. Everyone, I hope, is an atheist about Zeus and Apollo, Juno and Poseidon. I just added Jesus and Muhammad to that list.
So when Putnam and Campbell claim that religious people are nicer, there's no evidence to back that up. And in fact, if there's any evidence, it goes the other direction. Okay? But this is, again, I'm not trying to make claims that like all of you are better than they are. That's not where we're going today, right? I'm trying to make the point, what do the data say? And the data do not seem to suggest big differences on most of these.
Welcome back to Freethought Matters. That is sociologist Ryan Cragun speaking at FFRF's convention last fall in Denver. We're continuing our conversation with Professor Cragun, whose newest book is Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization.
So Ryan, I'd like to talk about the Pew Research Center's latest religious landscape survey that just came out this spring. And I don't know about you, but I felt the press release that Pew put up trumpeted that the decline of Christians, now at 62% of the population, has stabilized. I felt that was quite a spin. They also found that 49% of U.S. adults seldom or never attend religious services, but that wasn't the headline. And that the nuns, the religiously unaffiliated, are the single largest group by religious identification if you look at denominations of religion. So what did you think about the way they put that?
Yeah, this is always tricky, right? I know a bunch of the people at Pew, and I really like them, and I respect them as researchers. I did have a couple of quibbles as I read through this, because I, in preparation for this, I read it very, very carefully. It has gotten a little bit of kind of media attention recently that there hasn't been a continued uptick in the percentage non-religious, like identify as non-religious, for the last 3 to 4 years. People are starting to claim that it's leveled off. Now, I think if you dig a little deeper into the data, you can see that there are other things going on. And it may be the case that, sure, in terms of just identification, right? So how they identify their religiosity, that has leveled off a little bit. But there are other measures that suggest that even the religious are becoming less religious, which is always fun to say. It's a little weird to think about it that way, but there's secularization happening even among the religious. And we can talk about some of those findings and that are right in the Pew report as well.
Well, even the finding that 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds have no religious identification. I mean, that's huge.
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely huge. And to their credit on this one, it's a little weird how they frame it. So again, there's some framing issues that we can certainly, take issue with, but they kind of just have to admit that they see no evidence that people become more religious as they age, which means as older people die off, and I'm not like saying that that's a good thing, but people die, as older people die off and younger people are not turning back to religion, the US population has to grow more non-religious over time. It just has to. And there's no way that you can say that that's not going to happen. It's clearly going to happen.
Do you think that's parallel to what happened in Europe in history? Europe used to be such a religious continent fighting holy wars, and now most Europeans are pretty secular?
Yeah, I think we're definitely headed down that path. And there are other indicators to support that. So even in my book, which we talked a little bit about, we actually find using different measures that the percentage of people who are actually attending religious services is way lower than the self-reported percentages that Pew is giving. So yeah, we're going to continue down that path, I think. But definitely if you look at Europe today, there are countries where religious attendance on a weekly basis or roughly weekly basis is in the single digits. We're talking some Scandinavian countries, it's 2 to 4%. Other countries, it's 4, maybe 8%. But there are a number of countries, probably almost half of Europe at this point, where regular attendance, engagement with religious services is in the single digits. So that's how low it is.
Maybe we're catching up with Europe, huh?
We're definitely headed that way.
So there was another intriguing finding in this latest religious identification survey, and that is that only 5% of the population calls themselves atheists, but in fact, almost 17% told Pew they do not believe in God or a universal spirit. If you don't believe in God, by definition, that makes you an atheist. So is this just people shying away from the word atheist? And if so, maybe what should we do about that? Is it just squeamishness?
There's definitely that. So we've seen this in a lot of the research that we do. There are a number of people who say, look, yeah, I don't believe in God, but I'm not a new atheist like those guys. And usually they'll name some of the new atheists who are out there. Often it's a Richard Dawkins or a Christopher Hitchens, somebody like that. And it's because they see and they've associated atheism with a more confrontational form of atheism. So they often don't want the stigma that comes with identifying as an atheist, even though for all intents and purposes, they're atheists. So we definitely know that that's part of what's going on is people just don't identify that way. But this also gets at the way that Pew is asking the question. So the atheists that they report there, those are people who said that their religion is atheist. When they asked them, what is your religion, if any, they said atheist. like I said earlier, atheism is not a religion, right?
Yeah.
So I wouldn't actually respond that way. And I am an atheist, right? So if somebody said, what's your religion, if any, I'd say none. But if they asked me later on a question about belief in God, do you believe in God? I'd say no. So it's a little tricky that you're capturing two different things with these questions.
So we do want to quickly show some of the Pew findings that were significant about rejecting religion, such as 38% saying they seldom feel the presence of something from beyond the world. 32% seldom or never pray. A third do not believe in heaven, or even a higher percentage, 41%, reject belief in hell. So was any of this surprising to you?
Not really, but I will note something that I just had a paper accepted, I want to say like this week, where we're looking at a disconnect. And this disconnect, I think, is actually really important. And it's one of the things that Pew highlights quite a bit. If you read it closely, they talk about the percentage of people in the US, they've pulled out the non-religious in this in other places, but the percentage of people in the US who believe in a soul, and if you look at that, that's actually higher than the percentage of people who believe in an afterlife. And that got me thinking. I was like, wait, that's really weird. Why would somebody believe in a soul if they don't believe in an afterlife? So I've got this paper that's forthcoming that shows that what that seems to suggest is a lot of people who say they believe in a soul, they see the soul as just the personality.
Yeah.
It's nothing supernatural. It's just a very different conception. And this is one of the areas where I would kind of take issue with how Pew frames this. They're like, see how spiritual Americans are?
Right.
And it turns out you can say I believe in a soul and not have any notion of spirituality or supernatural belief. You're just like, oh, well, that's my personality. That's what makes me unique. That's what makes me who I am.
And I wonder
It's a
if
little
people
bit
can even be saying, I'm a spiritual atheist, and they don't really mean they believe in anything supernatural. You know,
Yeah, for sure.
they just have awe and wonder. I think that's a lot.
So in the 30 seconds we have left, anything to say about the importance of looking beyond the headlines and following the data?
Yeah, if you dig really deep into attendance, the number of people who are sending their kids to Sunday school, that's actually a really revealing number in there, because a lot of people are saying, oh yeah, I'm religious, but they're not sending their kids to Sunday school, which really is pretty revealing that, yeah, even among the religious, they're not as religious as people think.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Ryan Cragun, for being with us today. Your book is fascinating. It's called Goodbye Religion. Thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Always delightful to talk with you.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.